what you're seeing is a kind of continuity of Western stupidity, narcissism, self-absorption that we, as whatever the Western Bloc should be called, are fighting a lifestyle war using Ukraine as the poor proxy tar baby that is going to take all the punishment to satisfy our own needs.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. The headlines tumble around us these last days. We begin with what is described in Moscow as an attack by NATO on Mother Russia. I read headlines from the London Telegraph. Former British soldier fighting for Ukraine captured by Russia in Kursk. Another headline. Mystery drone spotted over British aircraft carrier. Another headline. Putin ready to cripple Britain with cyber attacks. Another headline. Russian general who faked victory sacked by Putin. And this in the Financial Times in these last hours. Russia recruits Yemeni mercenaries to fight in Ukraine. Mysterious Houthi-linked company duping men into joining Moscow's war machine. Well done, MI6. I like that word, duping there. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. Here we are by the Thames. And just when we thought we could never get anything as wonderfully ironic as the most recent election in the 21st century, America, along comes a NATO attack on Russia. I read the headline as given to us by CNN, a favorite network of the NATO forces. Ukraine fires U.S.-made longer-range missiles into Russia for the first time. Kristen Edwards is the author. The attack comes just 2 days after the Biden administration, writes CNN, gave Kyiv the green light to use the longer-range American weapons against targets inside Russia. Germanicus, to my memory, and I've not done a thorough search, but I'm pretty sure I've searched adequately. This is the first time NATO and the United States have ever fired a missile into Mother Russia. The whole of the 20th century, that was a nightmare scenario. And here we are in the 21st, and CNN's writing it up with metaphors such as green light. Your measure of Russia at this point, is this an attack on Mother Russia that is taken as grave in Moscow, or is it treated as the last gasp of the Biden administration? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. This entire affair reminds me of British plans, which Mr. Churchill supported, thanks to the Russian invasion of Finland. The UK and France were ready to stage French bombers from Syria to attack the Russian oil fields in Baku, so that the course of world history could have been changed had they actually struck those oil fields and set on fire the incredible, there was oil just rising from the ground. It could have been a disaster for the course of the West and for history, but it shows how half-cocked Western powers can be in their desire to use some military instrument as a stainless demonstration of their infinite virtue. And this is what we're looking at today, in the sense that the Western powers, US and NATO, created an aggressive strategic impetus against Russia, which culminated in this war. And now that they're losing the war, they want to do something feckless and futile to show their stainless virtue, just as France and Britain were about to do something magnificently stupid in the winter of 1940. So what you're seeing is a kind of continuity of Western um, stupidity, narcissism, a self-absorption that we, as whatever the Western Bloc should be called, are fighting a lifestyle war using Ukraine as the poor proxy tar baby that is going to take all the punishment to satisfy needs, our own needs to reinforce our sense of how great we are. And of course, Russia knows all of this. And if you track Russian commentary, Russian conversations, even just simply listening to Mr. Putin, you know that Russia understands that this is a kind of strange last gasp of NATO, and that what awaits NATO is the specter of defeat. And this escalation is frankly a kind of reflexive or maybe spasmodic and desperate response to try and keep the war going, or maybe to bring the conflict to a head in advance of the January 20 deadline when everything will change. And NATO is confronting the fact that the war that it prosecuted for the last 3 years, the war that it effectively crafted and manicured and curated and created, has come to nothing and it's about to fall apart. And so this is an opportunity, a final last gasp, a final throw of the die on the part of the elites in the EU and in Washington, the imperial city, to try and keep the war going. And it won't succeed because the fact is that Mr. Putin isn't going to be provoked by any of this. It would take some extraordinary strike on the part of Europe to bring Russia to the point where it would do something truly escalatory.
A detail. Russia did respond in some fashion 24 hours later by firing what is called an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. Technically, that's accurate.
Yes.
Longer than 5,500 kilometers is an ICBM. Hypersonic ballistic missile. Keith says it has no defenses from ballistic missiles, but it fired this in a fashion that Mr. Putin called experimental. The interpretation on the NATO side was this is a shot across the bow. He's got other missiles like this.
Yes.
I just want to describe that we're now shooting missiles at each other. And the ATACMS, there are no, to my knowledge, Ukrainian forces trained to fire ATACMS. That has to be a NATO crew.
It is always, and same with Taurus and Storm Shadow. The Oreshnik or hazelnut missile is an extraordinary order of magnitude leap in capability, because when it fires in a less than intercontinental mode, in a theater mode, obviously, which it did in the use against Dnipro, its conventional warhead, which consists of 38 rods from God. I mean, 38 kinetic rods, which each one at 200 kilos is going to wreak havoc. And apparently it did it. It leveled this factory complex in Dnipro. And it could level any NATO airfield. So rather than having to launch an airstrike of many dozens of planes against NATO facilities. All Russia needs to do is launch a single missile against a single airfield and completely knock it out.
Did NATO want this to happen? Did NATO know that Russia would respond with?
No, it's unprepared. This is a surprise, but NATO is responding. Who knows how? Who knows what kind of um, ripples or earth-shaking discussions are going on within NATO intelligence in the US. But the truth of the matter is, they've got us. I mean, Mr. Putin has sent a very discreet message that no, don't do this. We can actually take you apart, root and branch. And you have to understand that Russia has had 3 years of intense effort to create the capability that it has. It's been fighting a high level war for 3 years, and we've been sitting at the margins, playing around, giving the Ukrainians little things that we have, little baubles, like little drone attack boats that can go against Sevastopol, or other things that are nothing compared to what Russia has now as an actual powerful military. And
Quickly,
the U.S. has not responded by reforming and recreating its military capability, which it should have, given the way the Russians have responded. They have an intense advantage over us, and we've done nothing.
a simple 1 minute. What does London want? What is it? Why is Starmer in this game?
The British are in the game to maintain their special relationship with the US. Back in the day, when Churchill first succored or seduced Franklin Delano Roosevelt with his letters, he knew that Britain was done, and the only way Britain could aspire to a sense of its former grandeur was to be the most necessary sidekick of the United
All
States.
right,
What they're doing now.
let's go to the people of Europe then. We're looking at the European war underway. The escalation is recognizable. We've been through this sequence many times over the last 100 years. Escalation has its own logic, and part of it is you've got to turn it off. You've got to actively turn it off. You've got to reach in and do it. It doesn't stop by itself. Now, there are voices in Europe who are ready to turn it off. They're not going to sit back and say, Trump will do it. They're going to move on their own. One such group is called Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, it's called for short. It's a small party that started in formerly East Germany. It's now got sympathetic voices all across the German Republic. They're facing a no confidence vote in Olaf Scholz in the Bundestag in these next days, middle of December, I'm told. That'll call for a new election, which is scheduled now for February 23rd. Alternative for Deutschland is polling very well. What does it represent? Germany for Germany. Make Germany great again. Sound familiar? The immigrants out. The federal government out of our lives. Make friends with Russia. Bring the energy back. No more Ukraine war. No more Americans. No more NATO. Sound familiar? This is what is called in America a populist rising. It started in East, in small states. It's spreading very quickly. And there recently was an election in Saxony, Lower Saxony, doing very well in the place that is now closing plants for Volkswagen, the first time since before the Second War. You are foolish in politics if you underestimate a populist movement because it's way ahead of where you think it is. It moves very quickly. And there is an anti-incumbent mood all over the world. And Olaf Scholz will fall. The coalition, traffic light coalition will fall. I tell this story in detail because I want it to be possible for you to recognize this is MAGA. This is MAGA in Deutschland. And it's also in France. And it's also, it has the Italian government. The Brotherhood of Italy is MAGA. Giorgia Meloni represents a coalition of populists. Is it in London? Not in the Labour Party, but in these last days, there was a protest by the farmers of Great Britain driving their tractors into central London and protesting the arbitrariness of the budget put together by Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, that wants to punish anybody who wants to leave his farm to his children. That's it. Inheritance tax. They want to cripple it. So you have to sell your farm to pay the taxes to pass to your children. That is a populist rising. Germanicus, I'll stop there and say that they're moving very quickly across the continent of Europe. We know they rejected the EU in the election last year. We know they're ready to reject anything that NATO does, the populists. Are they moving fast enough in your measure? Can they help us here in America?
MAGA in Deutschland is a rejection of the NATO power politics of the last 30 years, or at least since the fall of the Soviet Union. The moment NATO was no longer threatened by Russia, the entire rationale of NATO began to transform into a structure of U.S. imperial control of Europe and of European vassalage. And the essence of this war, as we've seen it unfold for 3 years, has been the ratification and reification of NATO vassalage and its institutionalizing by the US. And why would NATO accept such a subordinate, even craven position, such a servile position? Well, because NATO elites are well rewarded in the US constellation of globalization. And that constellation meant that American elites, in conjunction with European elites, were self-selected to be the rulers of the new world and to rule forever. And the war in Ukraine became an instrument in which this control could be actualized. It could be implemented. And in fact, it was preceded several years before by the extraordinary COVID hysteria. And that was a kind of rehearsal for what happened with the war in Ukraine. And if you put all of this together, what you see is that the war is less about geopolitics and less about Russia and more about the US and its EU elites creating a structure of control. That control has been challenged in America, obviously, by MAGA. It's being challenged now in Europe in a fundamental grassroots, up from the soil rebellion. And the fact is that the war is central to this because the war was the rod and staff of European elites in their effort to create a structure that would maintain their control over the people.
I observe that there's something else in Germany, just to mention, Sarah Wagenknecht. She's a straight up old-fashioned communist.
Yes. Well,
And her party is one person.
Yes.
does very well in the polling. And so what we're looking at here is a kind of anarchy,
Well,
which,
it is. It
which
is.
they're
Yeah.
going to reject, they're going to vote for anything that rejects Berlin.
Yeah, well, okay, there are a couple data points here historically. I mean, one, going back to the French Revolution, is that the extreme right and the extreme left in the French Assembly, in in the mountain, in the circle of the French Assembly, were very close. And in fact, you've seen this closeness between right and left, who are essentially revolutionaries, replicated recently in the US, where you could see in Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump a kind of strange, never acknowledged, but always present kinship of a kind, in that their both of their venues and agendas were rooted in representing the people against oppressive elites. And that is why you can see um, a, a, a correspondence between what we call the extreme right and the extreme left. Actually, they're simply getting together. And of course, if they do get together, it's all over for the elites. But I think it's all over anyway. The elites are all about cementing their control and creating not a class system, but a caste system in the US and Europe. And the people in the US and Europe are revolting against that. And what is so interesting about the war in Ukraine is that this war, which was in effect created as an instrument to help maintain elite control by creating the emergency of potential mobilization and a potential Cold War, thereby reinforcing and cementing the authority of elites in this kind of, crazy context. That's all been blown up. And now elites are in a position of total flight. And their last ditch effort to stop this is to try and escalate into World War III.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. A short vignette. It doesn't belong with the seriousness of NATO's provocations and attacks on Russia, nor does it belong with the rising of the populist parties in Europe, condemned by the same loud, powerful, esteemed, credentialed voices in Germany, in London, in Rome, in Brussels especially, that condemn it here. Same voices. Michael and I are credentialed. We were educated and trained. We were picked out by the Lyndon Johnson era to be Cold Warriors, to be part of the ruling class that would defend America from the, call it what you want, evil empire. However, now, these many decades later, Michael and I are in seniority, Germanicus and Gaius in our first century AD Roman guys. We see it. It was entertaining. We were well treated, but the dream is gone. And so now we come to a piece of the dream that was unpredictable. I don't think anybody would have found this imaginable even 10 years ago, which is that Tiberius, Joe Biden, is not always present. He makes a speech in Manaus. He reads it, not from a teleprompter. They didn't have his teleprompters up. He had to look down. And the speech was voiced in that angry voice of his where he's attacking MAGA. He was not dressed well. He always wears a beautiful suit, tight fitted, make him feel younger, I guess. I wear very loose clothes. And he finished the speech, turned around, and wandered into the Amazon forest by himself. And you watch this happening thinking, surely this is scripted. But then the Secret Service and his aides ran after him because he's wandering into the Amazon. Nobody's there. Germanicus, I've seen explanations for this, but none of them are adequate. It's strange. It's strange business. The vice president, we're told, is in Hawaii vacationing after her very strident campaigning the last months. The Secretary of State, I don't know where he is. The National Security Advisor, I presume that he's in the war room in Washington. We fired missiles into Russia. Russian version of NORAD went off. And then Russia fired an ICBM into Kiev. And the European NORAD went off. It's supposed to. The satellite said beep, beep, beep. And we don't have a president most of the time. I think it's funny. Is it, Germanicus?
It is as funny as it was to be in Paris in 1789 with your king, Louis XVI. And this is not to give poor Louis a bad rap. He did the best he could, but he was not in a position to be an effective executive, nor was poor Nicholas II under the pressure of war in the early months of 1917 when he was overwhelmed and incapable of making command decisions. But here we see something actually very different. What we're seeing here is an executive who actually inhabits not simply a monarchical position, but a position of elected emperor, an exalted, world-straddling executive authority that is really, in effect, no different from that of a Roman emperor. And in Rome, if an emperor was that mentally incontinent, he would not survive a day. And in fact, Tiberius, in his later days in Capri, did not last either. He was disposed of. And the fact is that, of course, that fate awaits Mr. Biden, but it begs the question of what sort of ruling class would present Americans with a series. And it's a short series, but it is a president, Mr. Biden, and a presumptive heir, Ms. Harris, each of whom represents a, a, a potential or real executive who is incompetent or not there. How could a ruling class do that? Because what does it say about that ruling class? It says, first of all, that they believe that the people are irrelevant and they can be told whatever they need to be told as long as it's done through the proper seductive or manicured or comfortable massaging of social media.
Couple of minutes, Germanicus, couple of minutes.
So they betray their own contempt for the American people. And by extension, that contempt extends to the Constitution, to the very idea of America. And in every way, the ruling establishment in America has acted for the last decade has been not simply to have contempt for America and contempt for its constitutional vision, but a kind of smug and complacent belief in its own right to rule, that took an election that they did everything to overturn in the sense that they wanted a different outcome. And the fact is that the people, when given finally an opportunity to express how they felt, rejected them. And this rejection is one of the great moments in the American experience because it stopped what was the onset of a kind of grand tyranny, the kind that you would see um, in the High Middle Ages, in the period of the divine right of kings in France, or of the czarist autocracy. All of that was impending, and it was averted, but only barely. And the fact that such an elite could emerge, take root, and take command in America is worrisome because, of course, that elite is still in control of the commanding heights of our institutions. And this is a process that we see time and again in history. It's worrisome, and the doom of empires is always in to be found in a complacent and selfish elite.
A year from now, Germanicus, yes or no? Will we laugh about this?
We may. I hope so.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I'm Gaius, John Batchelor. We're by Londinium. We're going to the theater, Aristophanes, The Clouds, just a scene from it, where our hero joins the thinkery because his wastrel son won't. And he learns that the discoveries of the thinkery, this is meant to mock Socrates, include absolutely calibrating how far a flea can jump. That's the thinkery. And the Greeks find this hilarious. I find it preferable to the Greeks being serious, but I still don't get it. I'm just a Roman guy who likes his slapstick raw. By Londinium, on our way to the theater, of course, we'll sacrifice to the god Augustus, who started this merry, merry time. 21st century later, the President of the United States is not entirely here. I'm John Batchelor.